In the shattered fields of Normandy, where burnt-out Shermans smoldered beside twisted hedgerows and the air reeked of diesel and cordite, a small platoon of American tankers stumbled upon a monster, a machine so feared, so mythologized, that even its silhouette could send ripples of unease through battle-hardened men. The Tiger I, it wasn't just a tank. It was an icon of German engineering supremacy, thick armor, monstrous firepower, and a reputation for being nearly unstoppable. But on that gray morning, when the mist lifted just enough for its iron bulk to emerge from behind a barn, the men of the 3rd Armored Division froze in disbelief. The beast wasn't firing. It wasn't moving. The mighty Tiger had stopped dead in its tracks. Its crew had vanished, the hatches left open like gaping wounds. For a full minute, the Americans said nothing. Then one voice, hushed, disbelieving, cut through the silence. Holy hell. Is that what I think it is? Cameras weren't rolling, but history was. The moment they climbed inside, their awe turned to shock. The smell of scorched oil and fuel hung thick, the steel interior cramped and suffocating. And then came the realization that would ripple through the entire Allied command. This fearsome tank, this supposed invincible fortress, could only travel about 120 miles on a full tank of fuel. To the American crews who'd driven Shermans across France on half the gas, it was almost laughable. Almost. Because beneath that discovery was something deeper. A glimpse into how the German war machine, for all its brilliance, had engineered itself into exhaustion. But before they could analyze it, before they could even celebrate their prize, they had to get the Tiger running. Or at least towed back to their lines before German artillery noticed. That's when the real story began. Imagine the scene. American GIs clambering over a tank that had once terrorized them, shouting orders, hammering at levers, trying to understand a control system designed by men who thought in a different language, mechanically, philosophically, even arrogantly. Every dial, every switch, every gauge screamed precision, but also complexity. It took 10 minutes just to figure out the starter sequence. One of them joked, "No wonder the Krauts lost this one. They probably ran out of gas before they got it started." Laughter echoed briefly, but the tension was real. They were deep behind contested lines, and the rumble of German panzer divisions still shook the earth beyond the hedgerows. Then came the roar, deep, guttural, metallic. The Tiger's Maybach engine coughed to life like a dragon awakening. Its sound was unlike anything they'd heard before, smoother, lower-pitched, almost regal. Even the Shermans parked nearby seemed like toys in comparison. But as they revved it, the fuel gauge already dropped visibly. It was like watching power burn itself away. And that, the Americans realized, was the Tiger's hidden curse, brute strength with a fatal flaw, inefficiency. Over the next few hours, military engineers swarmed the captured vehicle. They photographed every angle, traced wiring, examined the gearbox. They'd heard stories of Tigers ambushing entire armored columns, knocking out 10 tanks before vanishing. But standing over it now, they saw the truth. Yes, it was a masterpiece, but it was also a logistical nightmare, consuming more fuel, more resources, and more time than any army fighting on multiple fronts could sustain. The Allies had factories that could build 10 Shermans for every Tiger, and the Shermans didn't guzzle fuel like it was champagne. Still, the sight of that massive steel beast rolling under American stars was unforgettable. Soldiers from nearby units came just to see it, to touch it, to climb inside, to take pictures like it was a fallen god. One GI wrote home, "You should see this thing. It's like the Germans built a cathedral on tracks, and it still couldn't outrun us." That quote would later appear in army reports, a symbol of how the Allies saw the German war machine, magnificent but unsustainable. And yet, the deeper shock came when they started disassembling parts of it. Bolts and screws machined so precisely that American wrenches didn't quite fit. Bearings polished to mirror finish. Even the paint, a layered anti-corrosive compound Wick was over-engineered. Everything screamed perfectionism, the kind that wins admiration in peacetime but bleeds you dry in war. As the sun set on that first day, one of the officers leaned on the Tiger's hull and whispered, "This thing's gonna tell us more about Germany than any prisoner could." He was right. In the coming weeks, the captured Tiger would be studied, tested, and even paraded in front of generals. It would expose the fatal paradox of the Nazi war effort, the obsession with technical perfection at the expense of practicality. But that revelation didn't happen all at once. It began with the smell of burnt oil in a French field, and a few stunned American tankers realizing that their enemies Most feared weapon could barely make it to Paris on a full tank. Still, that night, as artillery flares lit the horizon, the Tiger's black silhouette stood like a shadow of German pride. And somewhere in the distance, a lone panzer crew was reporting to headquarters that Tiger 131 had not returned. The war had taken another turn, one not decided by who fired the first shot, but who could keep their machines moving the longest. And for the Americans, the lesson was clear. The Tiger was terrifying, but the Ford factories back home were unstoppable. When the first rays of the French dawn crept across the captured Tiger, its armor glowed a dull bronze under the soot and grime, a monument to the twisted logic of Nazi engineering. American mechanics gathered around it like archaeologists at a dig site, aware that every bolt might hide a secret. The tank loomed over them, 56 tons of metal arrogance, and the men who'd spent the war inside rattling Shermans could hardly believe that human beings were supposed to fight from within such a fortress. As the engineers pried open hatches and panels, the Tiger's guts spilled out like the anatomy of an extinct predator. Cables, pistons, drive shafts, coolant lines, all thicker, heavier, and more complicated than anything they'd ever seen. The Maybach HL-230 engine gleamed under the dim light, a 700-horsepower monster that purred with mechanical dignity, but its thirst was biblical. 1 gallon for every half mile. The Americans shook their heads. It didn't matter how terrifying the Tiger's gun was if it drank fuel faster than Germany could refine it. They drained the tanks and found residue, sludge thick as syrup, proof that the Germans had been cutting their gasoline with whatever they could find. That was the real revelation. The enemy wasn't running on strategy anymore. They were running on fumes. The engineers cataloged everything. They measured the 88mm KWK-36 gun, marveled at its rifling, and noted how perfectly machined each round chambered. In isolation, it was genius. In war, it was insanity. Every barrel required man-hours that Ford or General Motors would have used to make an entire Jeep. Each weld line told a story of overwork and desperation. You could see where late-war German factories had substituted slave labor for skilled welders. The beads were uneven, the seams sloppy, yet the design insisted on microscopic tolerances. It was as if perfection had become Germany's religion, even when perfection no longer mattered. One American lieutenant scribbled in his notebook, "They built it like they'd never run out of time. We built ours like we couldn't afford to waste a minute." That difference, the obsession with artistry versus the obsession with output, was why Detroit was winning the war. As they stripped the gearbox, they discovered why the Tiger was so slow to repair in the field. To reach a single clutch plate, the entire transmission had to be lifted out with a crane. A broken final drive could immobilize the whole vehicle for weeks. The Tiger wasn't designed to be fixed under fire. It was designed never to break, which in war meant it broke constantly. When the Americans compared this to the modular layout of a Sherman, which could be repaired roadside with a wrench and brute force, they finally grasped how ideology had seeped into engineering. The Germans saw the tank as a masterpiece. The Americans saw it as a tool. Tools win wars. Masterpieces win museums. For hours, the dismantling continued. The soldiers watching from a distance treated the Tiger like a celebrity autopsy. Some laughed as the engineers cursed at jammed bolts. Others took bets on how many parts it had. By dusk, the ground around the tank was littered with components, track links, armor plates, gearboxes, each tagged for shipment to Allied intelligence. When an officer from the Ordnance Corps arrived, he didn't even look impressed. He simply said, "Get it on a truck. Washington's gonna want to see this." What he didn't say, but every man understood, was that this hulk of steel might rewrite the next generation of tank design. That night, over campfire coffee, the mechanics compared notes. One remarked that the Tiger's interior felt like an overbuilt submarine, tight, claustrophobic, suffocating. Another pointed out that the vision slits were so narrow the driver could barely see the battlefield. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The Germans had built a nearly indestructible tank that blinded its own crew. Power without visibility, strength without endurance. It was a metaphor for the Reich itself, and yet nobody could deny its presence. Even dismantled, it radiated menace. When moonlight struck the curve of its mantlet, it looked alive, as if waiting for someone to reassemble it and unleash it once more. But what haunted the Americans most was the simplicity of the lesson buried inside all that complexity. The Tiger's 120-mile range wasn't a random figure. It was the physical expression of Germany's strategic blindness. Every mile required fuel hauled by convoys already being bombed to oblivion by Allied aircraft. Every spare part demanded factories that no longer existed. The Tiger was brilliant in theory, doomed in practice, a king stranded in a desert of logistics. By contrast, the Shermans rolled endlessly forward, refueled by a supply chain so vast that entire ships carried nothing but gasoline. Numbers defeated nuance. Factories defeated finesse. In the following days, the captured Tiger was loaded onto a train bound for England, where British and American experts would test it at Bovington. The American crews watched it leave, its tracks clanking like manacles. One sergeant muttered, "That thing'll end up teaching our grandkids how not to build a tank." He was right. But before it reached the proving grounds, rumors already spread through the ranks. The Tiger wasn't invincible after all. It was just expensive. And in war, expensive dies faster than fragile. As the train disappeared into the smoky distance, thunder rolled across the western sky. Artillery. Somewhere ahead, another Tiger was moving to the front, burning precious gallons every mile. The Americans who had captured this one now knew the enemy's weakness wasn't courage or firepower, it was physics. And as they mounted their Shermans and rolled east toward the Rhine, they carried with them a strange mix of respect and pity. Respect for the men who had built such a machine. Pity for the nation that thought it could win wars with monuments. The Tiger's armor was supposed to be its soul, 100 millimeters of face-hardened steel, a shell so thick that most Allied rounds bounced off like pebbles against a wall. For 2 years it had been the nightmare of every Allied tanker, the silhouette that froze hearts on the European front. But when the captured Tiger reached the Allied testing range, the truth that emerged from its armor plates was far more shocking than anyone had dared imagine. The Americans and British engineers approached it like surgeons, marking points with chalk, taking photographs, running their hands along weld seams that were as rough as scar tissue. At first glance, the plates looked flawless, mirror-polished, unyielding. But under the cold scrutiny of metallurgy, perfection crumbled. When test shots were fired at the removed armor sections, not even with armor-piercing tungsten rounds but with standard Sherman shells, faint cracks began to spider across the steel. At first, they thought it was a fluke. Then they fired again and again, and the fractures deepened. The mighty Tiger's armor wasn't uniform. It was brittle in places, compromised by rushed production and contaminated steel. The metallurgists were stunned. Germany's shortage of high-grade alloys had forced factories to cut corners. Nickel, molybdenum, and vanadium, all essential for maintaining ductility, were being rationed for submarines and aircraft. The once perfect formula for tank steel had been diluted with impurities. As one British engineer muttered, they made their armor strong enough to stop a shell but weak enough to shatter from its own strength. It was poetic, in a dark way. The armor that had made the Tiger invincible had become its silent betrayer. When American analysts filed their reports, they didn't mince words. Enemy armor quality declining, brittle under stress. What that meant, in the cold logic of war, was devastating. Every Tiger fielded after mid-1944 was not just expensive, it was vulnerable. Inside the tank, the Americans found more unsettling evidence. The inner welds showed rushed workmanship, as if the factories had been bombed mid-production, which in truth they often had. The Germans had been forced to move assembly to underground facilities, working by candlelight with untrained laborers and worn-out machines. Every inch of steel told that story. One sergeant, running his gloved hand over a rough seam, said quietly, "This thing's tough on the outside, falling apart on the inside. Just like the Reich." And that line, that single observation, summed up what intelligence officers would later brief to command. The Tiger was a reflection of Germany itself. Terrifying, magnificent, and rotting from within. When Allied ballistics teams began testing slope angles and penetration data, they made another discovery that would alter tank doctrine forever. Despite its thickness, the Tiger's vertical armor was its undoing. While German engineers had prioritized sheer mass, American and Soviet designers were learning that angling armor, like on the T-34 and later the M26 Pershing, gave better deflection with less weight. It was geometry versus brute force. The Tiger's straight plates, so proud and imposing, became traps for kinetic energy. Even a 75mm round, if it struck just right, could punch through where the steel had lost its temper. When they tested at 500 yards, the results were shocking. 3 penetrations out of 5. For years, Allied gunners had believed they were powerless. Now they realized the Tiger had weaknesses all along. The myth had outlived the reality. In intelligence briefings, photos of the cracked armor were passed around like contraband. Generals who had once dreaded reports of Tiger sightings now saw numbers, graphs, and metallurgical charts that told a different story. "Gentlemen," one British colonel said, tapping the photo with his pen, "this is not invincibility. It's fragility disguised as strength." The room fell silent. That revelation didn't just change morale, it changed tactics. American tankers began aiming differently. Gunners were trained to target lower plates, turret rings, and drive sprockets instead of wasting shots on the mantlet. Knowledge was ammunition, and suddenly the Allies were fighting smarter, but the story of the Tiger's armor didn't end at the firing range. Deep in the archives of Ford and General Motors' research departments, engineers pored over the recovered samples. What fascinated them wasn't just the flaw, it was the philosophy. The Germans had built with obsession. The Americans built with purpose. The Tiger's armor in its excess became a textbook lesson in diminishing returns. It taught American designers that a tank's worth wasn't measured in inches of steel, but in how efficiently that steel was used. The post-war evolution of the M48 and M60 patent would be direct descendants of this revelation. Yet at the time, on that windswept English testing field, all anyone could think about was the irony. The Tiger, for all its glory, was dying by the very thing that made it feared. Still, the engineers couldn't help but respect it. One of them, a former Ford metallurgist, reportedly stood by the stripped turret and said, "If you gave us the resources, we could build one of these every day. But we wouldn't, because that's not how you win a war." It was a quiet moment of truth. The Tiger was an engineer's dream and a general's nightmare. Too heavy to move, too costly to maintain, too complex to repair. For every one Tiger that rumbled to the front, 10 Shermans rolled off assembly lines, humming across Europe like an unstoppable tide of steel. Numbers once again beat brilliance. When word of these findings reached frontline commanders, the psychological shift was immediate. Tank crews who had once whispered Tiger like a curse now spoke it with confidence. The spell was broken. The boogeyman had been demystified. For the first time, Allied tankers realized that courage wasn't just about facing the enemy. It was about understanding him. And understanding revealed that the Tiger wasn't a god of war. It was a relic of an empire that built monuments when it needed machines. As dusk fell over the testing range, the engineers packed their samples and reports, leaving the Tiger's empty shell behind. The wind whistled through its turret like a requiem. Somewhere far away, German industry was collapsing, its furnaces cold, its trains halted by bombing raids. The once mighty Tiger program was devouring its own tail. And as the Allied engineers boarded their trucks, one looked back and murmured, "Beautiful but doomed." When Allied engineers climbed into the Tiger's turret for the first time, they expected to find elegance, a masterpiece of human-centered design befitting Germany's reputation for precision. What they found instead was a paradox, a machine that was perfect on paper but punishing in practice. The interior was tight, dark, and stifling. Every lever, gauge, and handle was meticulously placed, yet the overall experience was claustrophobic, a cage of genius where every inch screamed of control, not comfort. The gun breech alone dominated half the space, its enormous recoil system leaving just enough room for the loader to move if he turned sideways. The smell was overpowering, oil, cordite, sweat, and fear soaked into steel. And even before firing a shot, every man who entered understood what it meant to live inside a legend that could kill its own crew with exhaustion. The first thing American analysts noticed was how unforgiving everything was. The loader's workspace was a death trap of angles, ammunition stacked floor to ceiling, sharp edges waiting to gouge hands in turbulence. The commander's cupola offered decent visibility, but required constant swiveling to maintain situational awareness. The gunner's seat, rigid and narrow, was wedged between mechanical linkages, leaving bruises after a single engagement. Every movement had to be choreographed, every reload a ballet of risk. It was efficiency without empathy, the German obsession with mechanical precision overriding the reality that human beings had to operate the machine. One U.S. ordnance officer described it perfectly. "It's a symphony for machines, not men." As they documented the turret's layout, the Americans realized that even communication inside the Tiger was a nightmare. Engine noise drowned out speech, so crew members relied on hand signals or shouted commands, a fatal flaw in the chaos of battle. The radio operator, isolated by the engine bulkhead, often couldn't hear the commander at all. The intercom, when it worked, crackled like distant thunder. Every second of miscommunication could be the difference between a kill or being killed. Contrast that with American Shermans, which used simpler, standardized radio systems that allowed tank platoons to coordinate like a single organism. The Tiger, by comparison, was a collection of individuals trapped in a metal labyrinth, each fighting both the enemy and the machine itself. But the real revelation came when the engineers measured the turret traverse speed. The Tiger's massive gun could crush armor with terrifying power, but turning it was painfully slow. The hydraulics, while robust, were never designed for rapid rotation. A well-trained crew could traverse 360 degrees in roughly a minute, but under combat stress, it often took longer. Meanwhile, a Sherman could pivot its turret twice as fast. On paper, that difference seemed small. On the battlefield, it was lethal. A faster enemy could flank, fire, and vanish before the Tiger could react. "The bigger they are, the slower they turn," one tank commander joked. But behind the humor lay truth. The Tiger's strength was also its weakness. Inside that turret, American engineers discovered another secret: the psychological cost of perfection. Every German crewman had to memorize hundreds of procedures, each more complex than the last. The startup checklist alone resembled a pilot's pre-flight log. Miss a single step, and the engine might stall or the turret lock might jam. Under fire, that complexity became chaos. One captured German tanker later confessed, "We feared our own machine more than the enemy. If one valve stuck, if one hose leaked, we were finished." That admission sent chills through the analysts. The Tiger was an apex predator that demanded absolute obedience from its crew and punished even the smallest mistake. When the Americans simulated combat inside the captured Tiger, they were shocked by how poor visibility truly was. Through the narrow slits, the outside world appeared as fragments, a flicker of light, a shadow of movement. The commander's periscope offered limited range, often fogged by smoke and condensation. It was like fighting a war from inside a coffin. The British observer who recorded the test wrote, "The Tiger gives the illusion of power, not the experience of it." Those words, circulated in internal reports, became the psychological turning point of the study. The Allies realized that what terrified them most about the Tiger wasn't its gun or its armor. It was the myth. And yet the engineers couldn't deny the brilliance woven through the madness. The 88mm gun was a masterpiece of ballistics, capable of piercing 100mm of armor at 1,000 yards. The optics, crafted by Zeiss, were unrivaled, crystal clear, allowing gunners to see and hit targets long before being spotted themselves. These elements were what made the Tiger legendary, but they came at a cost. Precision optics required rare materials. The gearbox demanded obsessive machining. The suspension used interleaved road wheels that clogged with mud and froze solid in winter. Every advantage was a liability in disguise. By the end of their analysis, the Americans understood what no battlefield rumor had captured. The Tiger wasn't built to win a long war. It was built to avoid losing a short one. It was Germany's answer to desperation, an iron monument to pride. Every component screamed, "We can still out-engineer you," even as the Reich crumbled. The irony was unbearable. The tank that symbolized power had become an emblem of futility. That night, as the engineers packed up their notebooks, one stayed behind. He climbed back into the turret, sat in the gunner's seat, and stared through the cracked periscope at the horizon. In that moment, he imagined the German crews who had lived and died inside this metal tomb. Young men, many not older than 20, trapped in a machine that demanded perfection in a world drowning in chaos. He whispered to himself, "They built a monster to win a war, and it ended up devouring them." Outside, the cold wind rattled the Tiger's armor plates, and the sound echoed like distant thunder. The war was still raging across Europe, but here, in this silent yard, the truth of the Tiger had already been revealed. It wasn't indestructible. It wasn't even practical. It was beautiful, tragic, and doomed. The perfect metaphor for the empire that birthed it. The moment Allied troops first heard the low, metallic growl of a Tiger's Maybach engine, it wasn't just the sound of steel in motion, it was the sound of fear itself. That thunderous roar, echoing through forests and across open plains, didn't just announce a tank. It declared dominance, and that was by design. Before a single tiger ever rolled onto the battlefield, Joseph Goebbels and his propaganda ministry were already building its legend, crafting a monster that would haunt Allied soldiers long before they ever saw one. Posters, films, and radio broadcasts hailed the tiger as an unstoppable steel beast, a tank so invincible that even the ground trembled beneath its treads. It was the perfect psychological weapon, a war machine that didn't need to be everywhere, only believed to be everywhere. When the tiger first appeared in 1942 near Leningrad, Soviet troops thought they were facing multiple tanks. They weren't. It was just one tiger, moving through fog and debris, its 88mm cannon echoing like artillery. The Red Army soon gave it a nickname that spread like wildfire: the Ghost of Kursk. Entire units froze or retreated at the mere sound of its engine. That fear traveled fast. By the time the Western Allies landed in North Africa, the tiger's reputation had preceded it. American intelligence reports described it as virtually indestructible, capable of shrugging off direct hits from anything short of naval guns. It was, in short, the monster in every soldier's imagination, the bogeyman of the battlefield. But here's the shocking truth that historians only pieced together later. By 1943, Germany had fewer than 100 tigers in active combat. Just 100, across the entire Eastern and Western fronts combined. Yet Allied tank crews swore there were hundreds. Infantrymen claimed they saw them everywhere. What they actually saw in most cases were Panzer V's or Panthers, often misidentified under stress. The Nazi propaganda machine had done its job perfectly. The myth had become more powerful than the metal. It was genius, one Allied psychological warfare officer later wrote. They made us fight a ghost, and ghosts are impossible to kill. Inside Germany, the tiger became a symbol of hope amid despair. As Allied bombers reduced cities to rubble, newsreels played footage of the mighty tiger crushing Soviet armor, its treads rolling over wreckage like destiny itself. School children were told their fathers and brothers were protected by the invincible tiger. Newspapers called it Der König der Panzer, the king of tanks. But the reality was more fragile. The same films that inspired civilians were often staged with prototypes or disabled tanks. Engineers would tow non-functional tigers into position just for the camera, rotate the turret manually, and film it as if it were operational. Every roar of its engine on screen was an illusion, a performance for morale. For German tank crews, however, the propaganda was a curse. Once the tiger was labeled invincible, they were expected to prove it every time they rolled into battle. Retreat was unthinkable. Surrender was dishonor. They were not just soldiers, they were living symbols of Nazi pride. That pressure crushed them as surely as Allied artillery. One German commander confessed after capture, "When we entered the fight, it wasn't the enemy we feared. It was failing the myth." Those words, recovered from post-war interrogation reports, reveal the dark side of that psychological warfare. The tiger didn't just terrorize the enemy, it terrorized its own men. As American engineers examined the captured tiger at Aberdeen Proving Ground, they began comparing its mechanical flaws to its legendary image. The results were astonishing. The mighty, indestructible tiger required constant maintenance, broke down after just 120 miles, and guzzled fuel faster than any Allied tank. In truth, the Americans realized the legend had more horsepower than the tank itself. Yet on the battlefield, perception mattered more than performance. Allied units often diverted entire artillery batteries to deal with a single reported tiger sighting, wasting precious shells on targets that weren't even there. Psychological warfare experts in the US and Britain took notes. They saw in the tiger's myth a blueprint for future military deception, how to weaponize fear, how to turn rumor into strategy. The British even studied captured German propaganda films frame by frame, analyzing camera angles, lighting, and narration. They realized that every shot of the tiger was deliberately composed from below, emphasizing its size, while the narrator's voice, deep, steady, almost godlike, reinforced the illusion of invincibility. The tiger wasn't just a machine. It was cinema, a production of industrial mythology designed to make men tremble, and it worked, until it didn't. By 1944, When the Allies began overwhelming German forces with sheer numbers and logistics, the myth of the Tiger began to crack. Soldiers who had once feared it now saw its weaknesses firsthand: its engine stalling in mud, its tracks seizing in snow, its armor vulnerable to airstrikes. The British 17-pounder gun, mounted on the Sherman Firefly, could pierce its armor at over 1,000 yards. Suddenly, the legend bled, and once blood was drawn, the illusion shattered. "The Tiger bleeds like any beast," one American tanker wrote in his journal after Normandy. "It dies loud, but it dies all the same." Yet even as the Tiger burned on the battlefield, its myth refused to die. After the war, Hollywood picked up where Goebbels left off. Movies like Kelly's Heroes, Saving Private Ryan, and countless documentaries turned the Tiger into an icon, a cinematic villain, the mechanical face of Nazi terror. Model kits, video games, and museum displays preserved its legend, often stripped of context. The Tiger became eternal, trapped in the collective memory as the ultimate tank. Few remembered that it was also a logistical disaster, an engineering marvel that couldn't outrun its own mythology. As the American engineers packed up the captured Tiger for testing, one of them made a note that would never leave the archives. "The Tiger is not a weapon. It is a story, one built on fear, faith, and steel." That line captures the truth more perfectly than any blueprint ever could. For every soldier who faced it, the Tiger was more than metal. It was a whisper of dread that echoed across continents, and that's where the greatest irony lies. The Tiger's most powerful weapon was never its gun, its armor, or its engine. It was the idea of the Tiger, an idea so potent that even today, 80 years later, its shadow still rolls across history. When Allied engineers finally pried open the armored backplates of the captured Tiger the Fern, they weren't just looking into an engine bay, they were staring into the molten heart of the Reich's most over-engineered dream. The moment the thick bolts released and the hatch creaked upward, a wave of scorched oil fumes rolled out like a ghost from the battlefield. Inside lay the legendary Maybach HL-230, P-45, 700 horsepower of pure mechanical ambition, a 12-cylinder monster designed to hurl 60 tons of armor across Europe. But what the Americans saw wasn't power, it was contradiction. Every pipe, gasket, and hose seemed built with obsessive perfection, yet cursed by fragility. It was as though German engineers had forged a racing engine and locked it inside a fortress. The result? A tank that could frighten nations, but could barely finish a campaign without eating itself alive. The Tiger's Maybach was thirsty, catastrophically so. At full throttle, it swallowed nearly 500 liters of gasoline for every 100 kilometers, which meant a single tank of fuel barely carried it 120 miles under ideal conditions. In combat, with mud, fire, and evasive maneuvers, that distance often fell to half. American mechanics who tested it back at Aberdeen couldn't believe it. "This thing drinks like a bomber," one of them muttered. And he wasn't exaggerating. The same amount of fuel that could keep a Sherman column rolling for days vanished inside the Tiger's belly in hours. The more they studied it, the clearer it became. The Tiger wasn't just a machine, it was an addiction, a fuel-devouring idol built for short, brutal bursts of dominance. German crews knew it too. In field diaries recovered from the Eastern Front, one driver wrote, "Our Tiger is mighty, but she is always hungry. Every kilometer we advance, she asks for more." Supply convoys strained to feed these beasts. Each Tiger required specialized fuel trucks and constant maintenance. If a fuel line cracked or a filter clogged, the entire 60-ton tank became an immovable bunker, its 88mm gun useless, its crew stranded and terrified. In winter, the fuel thickened. In summer, it evaporated before it reached the carburetors. The Maybach roared like a lion one moment and coughed like a dying dragon the next. Engineers tried fitting improved filters, redesigned pumps, even new spark plug arrangements, but nothing changed its nature. The Tiger was a glutton. The irony grew darker when you considered Germany's dwindling fuel reserves. By 1944, the Reich was bleeding petroleum. Allied bombers had pulverized the synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Politz. Columns of Tigers often sat camouflaged in woods not because they awaited orders, but because there was no fuel to move them. Some commanders used the Tigers as stationary artillery, burying the hull up to its treads to conserve gasoline. Others stripped engines from wrecked vehicles just to keep a single one running. Yet propaganda never wavered. Newsreels showed Tigers surging forward, black smoke pluming majestically. The truth was that many of those tanks had been towed into position for the camera. The Americans examining the captured machine couldn't help admiring the craftsmanship. Every piston was polished like a jewel, every gear machined to microscopic tolerances. It was engineering as art, but art that ignored logistics. One U.S. report summed it up bluntly. The Tiger's greatest weakness is Germany's inability to supply its appetite. To keep a Tiger battalion operational required almost the same fuel allotment as an entire division of Shermans. When Patton's armored corps raced across France in 1944, their tanks refueled from convoys stretching miles. German Tigers, by contrast, sputtered out on empty plains, victims of their own magnificence. And the Maybach had another curse: heat. In the cramped hull, temperatures soared past 55 degrees Celsius. Oil thinned, hoses melted, and the crew roasted. Drivers fought heat stroke while loaders wiped sweat from their eyes with rags soaked in diesel. Some crews rigged makeshift vents using empty shell casings to channel airflow. Others simply endured. One German gunner later told an Allied interrogator, "When we shut the hatches, it felt like being inside an oven that hated us." That sentence captures the human cost of perfectionist engineering. Yet despite its flaws, the Tiger's engine possessed a strange nobility. When it worked, it was sublime, smooth, deep, almost orchestral. Crews spoke of the moment when all 12 cylinders harmonized, when the vibration steadied and the machine seemed alive. "Then she breathes," they'd say. It was those fleeting moments that fed the myth, the sense that beneath all the steel and suffering, the Tiger had a soul. And perhaps that's why American engineers treated the captured Maybach with such reverence. They dismantled it bolt by bolt, labeling every piece, tracing its fuel lines, its exhaust routes, its cooling labyrinth. They wanted to understand not just how it ran, but why men had built it this way. When they compared it to the Sherman's Continental R975, the contrast was staggering. The Sherman's engine was simple, reliable, almost agricultural, a design that any field mechanic could fix with a wrench and determination. The Maybach demanded devotion, a priesthood of mechanics and spare parts. The Americans realized that this difference symbolized the entire war in miniature: Germany's obsession with perfection versus America's mastery of practicality. One built machines to impress, the other built machines to endure. Still, the Tiger's engine taught the Allies lessons they wouldn't forget. Post-war engineers studying the HL-230 found ideas that would influence Cold War tank design: modular engine blocks, centralized lubrication, advanced air filtration. Even in defeat, the Tiger whispered secrets to its conquerors. It was as if the beast once feared was now teaching its hunters how to build stronger prey.